Morning everyone, all the way down in Croydon. I've come from Bushell Park, North London today to be here with you, and it is a real pleasure. What I wanted to do today was to focus on what contextual safeguarding means when we think about the voice of the child. And I don't know who's clicking through for me or if there is a clicker. Thank you. While I share this presentation with you. And it was a good prompt actually, because normally people want me to come in and just talk about what contextual safeguarding is. So having to think specifically about what it means when we're thinking about the voice of the child is something I enjoy putting together. So there are three things I wanted to talk about. Firstly, to give you an overview of the contextual safeguarding framework, because you'll probably hear about contextual safeguarding a lot today, but it's often used in different ways and not always in the way it was intended. So I will briefly summarise the framework. After that, I will share the three ways I think that contextual safeguarding has implications for how we think about young people's voices and how we act on what they say, before sharing what I think this requires of all of your organisations. So, to begin with, the contextual safeguarding framework. It's always weird when you see the words contextual safeguarding in people's job titles or reports, because when I first coined the term in 2015, it was for my PhD, and people told me no one's ever going to read this apart from you and your examiners. So, anyone that's thinking about doing a PhD or is doing a PhD, don't believe that lie, because 10 years later it will be in people's job titles, and you'll think you could have been a bit less wordy. But anyway, here we go. The contextual safeguarding framework was introduced to address a very particular challenge that we were facing in the UK, and it is a challenge that is faced in many other countries around the world. And that is a challenge that young people tell us time and time again about the situations they are experiencing. And when I reviewed case files in 2011, children like Sarah had been very clear about the harm that they were experiencing. So she had said that she had been beaten up and bottled for something if she said no, and so she did say no, what would happen? She was pressurised and scared. She didn't want to be experiencing the harm she was experiencing, and she was being sexually exploited by a group of young people for about 18 months, between the ages of 11 and 13. She didn't want to be experiencing these things, but she felt like she didn't have a choice. So she was very clear about the situation she was in. And her mother was also very clear about the challenge that she was facing. She felt that there were things going on in Sarah's world that had far more influence over her than she did, and that she'd lost control of that situation. The social worker involved in assessing Sarah, however, described her as difficult to engage with, anti-police, and someone who places her friends and gang associates at higher importance than their family. And this type of account from professionals was common. It wasn't an exception. That was basically what I saw in case file after case file after case file when I was reviewing them 10 years ago. And that's because social workers were operating in a system that was designed to assess children and their parents, and not the situations that those children and parents were in. So young people were very clear about the situations they were in, and then social workers ignored those situations and targeted those individual children or their parents if their parents were felt to be able to do things more to keep their child safe. So we had a real mismatch between the design of our system and the challenges children were encountering. So the contextual safeguarding framework was offered in response to that challenge. And it requires four things of any system, organisation, or individual practitioner. So if someone says that they're doing contextual safeguarding, these are the four things that we look for. The first is we're looking at what you target. In a contextual safeguarding approach, you target the context the child is in. Now that might seem really obvious and common sense, but our systems are not designed traditionally to target context, they're designed to target individuals. So when you target a context, you don't just see a child in their context, you actively identify that context, assess it, and respond to it to try to build safety in the context where the child is. The second part of the framework is its legal basis. So a contextual safeguarding approach requires us to focus on children's needs and their welfare and hold those as paramount. So child protection legislation is the basis of the approach, not crime and disorder legislation. And thinking about that is really important, because if we think about how we have historically responded to contexts, we tend to have done that through a lens of crime and disorder. So to give you an example of that, when we know of many fast food chain outlets where young people are at risk of harm, and everyone gets very worried about young people spending time in those outlets, the advice historically had been to switch off the internet in those outlets so that young people would stop spending time in them. They would move on because they were accessing the internet. We didn't want them hanging around there. We switch off the internet, then move away. From a perspective of measuring impact on crime and disorder, that type of intervention is very effective. We were getting complaints about antisocial behaviour, we switched off the internet, the young people moved away, now we're not getting complaints about antisocial behaviour. So as a measure of crime and disorder, that's very effective. What we were seeing with that type of intervention was that adults, unsafe adults, were offering up their flats for young people to go and access the internet when the internet was switched off in fast food outlets, because their need to access internet remained. So switching off the internet just left children with an unmet need. So simply demonstrating a reduction in crime does not mean anyone's safer, and it certainly doesn't mean that children and young people's needs have been met. So when you're adopting a contextual safeguarding approach, any response to a context, group or a location has to be grounded in an understanding of what the children and young people in that context need from services, and your response has to meet those needs and not leave children with a set of unmet needs. That means they are even more unsafe than they were before we intervened. The third part of the framework are the partnerships that bring contextual safeguarding to life, and partnerships has already been mentioned this morning. Contextual safeguarding requires partnerships with young people and their families and communities, and it also requires partnerships with non-traditional safeguarding partners like those that work in hospitality, leisure, sports and recreation, education, youth work. Local residents, counsellors, all become key partners in the delivery of a contextual safeguarding approach. And finally, the system needs to measure its impact contextually. So you don't just look at your outcomes for individual children, you look at your outcomes for the context where they were coming to harm. So in the case of Sarah, the young woman's quote who I had up earlier, she was moved hundreds of miles away from her family and taken into care to try to protect her from exploitation. Then she was deprived of her liberty for 6 months, trying to protect her from exploitation. The two young women who witnessed the assaults on her became the new victims of that group once she was moved away. And they also didn't tell anyone for a very long time because they didn't want to be moved away from their families. So we might have created temporary safety for Sarah in the process, created new risks for children who were friends of Sarah because the park she was being exploited in remained unsafe. So we want to know when we're responding, are the parks, the high streets, the friendship groups, the school environments where the harm is happening being made any safer, or are we taking some young children out of that situation and other children are taking their place because we haven't made the context sustainably safer? And when we're measuring impact for individual children, which we do all the time, and voluntary sector organisations are particularly under pressure to do this, demonstrate a reduction in going missing, or a reduction in truancy, or a reduction in offending. None of these measures, again, are actually an indicator of safety unless we know the context in which that behaviour has changed. In one of the cases I reviewed, a young man was truanting from school, and it was the only behaviour he displayed that suggested there was anything happening for him. And the school had tried sanctions to try to get him into school on time and to keep him in lessons, and those sanctions proved ineffective. So children's services were contacted, and it turned out he had a sibling with a disability, and it was believed that maybe things were a bit chaotic at home, and if more support was put into the home environment, he would come into school on time and he would be able to focus when he was in lessons. The family said that wasn't the issue, but that was the intervention that was offered, and his behaviour did not change at school. There was then a threat to fine his family for not getting him into education, and within 2 weeks he was in school on time every day, and he stayed in lessons when he was there. So if we're measuring effectiveness simply by a reduction in truancy, the most effective intervention was a threat to fine his parents, because that was the thing that changed his behaviour. I was unfortunately called in to review his case 6 months after he started to go to school, because he was sexually and physically assaulted by a group of young people from his school, although the assault happened in an abandoned house outside of school. And it then turned out he'd been coming in late every day because he waited for everyone to be in classrooms before he had come into the school. And then he waited for teachers to be in those classrooms before he'd go into them. If he needed to use the toilets, he'd use the toilets during the lesson time rather than at the break time, because if he used the toilets in the break time, he was assaulted in the toilets. So the moment his truancy went down, his risk actually went up. A reduction in truancy was not an indication of safety for him at all, because he was staying away from a context that was unsafe for him. So changes in behaviour, reduction in truancy, reduction in missing episodes. Again, often when people are reported missing overnight by their parents a lot, people start exploiting them between 3 and 7 p.m. when they're not going to be reported missing. These changes in behaviour are not an indication of safety unless we can say, in this context, that is how that behaviour has changed. Truancy has gone down because school is a safer place for them to be, for example. If we don't know why the behaviour has changed, it could just be an indication of compliance and not an indication of safety at all. So contextual safeguarding requires those 4 things. It requires a response that targets the context where harm happens, with a focus on children's welfare and needs, in partnership with those that can create safety in extra-familial contexts, and where we measure our impact contextually. And while for some of you that might feel like common sense, it's completely counter-culture in terms of how our systems have actually been designed to operate. So for the last decade, we've worked with 96 local authorities across the UK, as well as practice organisations in Australia, Tanzania, Chile and Germany, to understand how you bring about that 4-part framework into an operational reality, how you convert that into a working way of doing things. And that's going to look different in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, because it is, by definition, contextual. But there are some things that we see that are very common. And the first is that the approach is implemented at 2 levels. We call this level 1 and level 2 contextual safeguarding. Level 1 is how you contextualise the work with individual children and young people. And primarily, this requires us to ask, where is this young person safest? Where are they least safe? We are trying to understand the context in which they are experiencing harm, not just the behaviour that they display in response to those contexts. And so when we do that, we try to think about the relationship between different contexts. So we see practitioners recognise that what's happening in the neighbourhood might be impacting what's happening in their local school, or what's happening in the school might shape the behaviour of a peer group, or what a peer group does might influence a young person's family because it may impact the capacity of their parents to regain control of that situation, or what a child then internalises and experience may play out back again in their neighbourhood, and so on and so forth. And in practice, what we then see are practitioners doing context weighting. Context weighting means looking at different contexts that a young person is spending their time in and weighting their influence. So for this young person with this image at the top, the school was the most unsafe context for them, followed by their peer group. What was happening in their neighbourhood and family was less influential, and that's why the school box is the biggest, followed by the peer group. Context weighting, again, feels quite obvious, but it's been very important because historically we would review assessments like Sarah's, which had lots of information about what they were facing in their peer group or their park or their school, and then the plan would be a 12-week parenting course for mum. It had nothing to do with the context where the young person was unsafe. What it did do was utilise the interventions that had been commissioned in the local area and create quite a bit of distance between the young person and their family and services, because they'd been very clear about what they needed, and what they were offered was not what they needed. So context weighting is a way for partnerships to ask themselves, is the plan we've put together for this child actually targeting the context where we have assessed they are unsafe? Or is our plan just representative of the services we have available to us and is unlikely to create safety in the context where this child is unsafe? And we have lots of free resources, including infographics online, to guide practitioners through their first experiences of doing context weighting. The more that services kind of contextualise their work with individual children, what we call level 1 contextual safeguarding, the more we then start to see level 2 contextual safeguarding, which is responses to the context themselves. And again, this has been a really important feature of the work because historically people thought responding to context meant just dispersing people out of them. That's responding to individuals in a context. That's not necessarily responding to a context. When we talk about responding to a context, we're talking about three things. We're talking about understanding the needs of the people in that context and whether those needs are being met. The guardianship available to young people in that context, i.e. the adults around them, whether they have access to any adults that they trust and provide safety for them and who like them and care about them. And then what are the environmental factors that might be undermining safety in that locality? And then the intervention plan targets 1, 2, or all 3 of those things. Might seek to meet young people's needs in that context, might seek to build guardianship in that context, or it might seek to address environmental factors in that context. So in any given locality, we might identify a need. So there's an issue at a bus terminus, or a train station, or in a college, or on a high street, and one of the issues is there's very low levels of guardianship, i.e. there aren't any adults available to young people who they trust and who care about them. So the plan might be to build guardianship in that context. That's the goal. How do you meet that goal? Well, that depends on where you're at. So in some areas that's included surveying businesses to understand what's already going on in terms of guardianship. Some of the best guardianship we've seen is often undercover. I remember once we were doing an assessment of a local area near a home where a young man's home had been shot at, and there was a plan to move him a distance from his family, and he didn't want to move and said he'd go missing from placement if he was moved. So there was an attempt to work out how to build safety in the location where he was, which included building guardianship in the surrounding area. So local businesses were surveyed to identify who might act as a potential community guardian. And in one chicken shop that we went into, we asked, how do you feel about young people's safety here? Do you provide any safety to them? Do you feel like they are unsafe? The owner said, oh no, I don't have any worries. Anytime there are fights in here, I just give out free chicken wings and it calms everyone down. And he was doing brilliant guardianship. That was absolutely excellent guardianship. He was de-escalating situations, he was avoiding criminalising children, he was trusted by them, he understood adolescent development, he didn't realise he did, but he absolutely did. But he was doing that all without the support of wider infrastructure and organisations, and that's the type of people that we're looking for to build community guardianship in localities. Or you might survey the area and there isn't anyone at all, you're really struggling. So you might need to do training with people, and often we see training on things like exploitation. I would always recommend training more on adolescent development and trying to work out which adults in the local area actually like young people and want to be around them, because there's lots of adults that just don't like young people and don't understand them, and we really do not want them being community guardians, and training isn't going to save them. Like, you need to do a lot more than a bit of training to build them up to be community guardians. Or you might map the local area with young people and identify who the adults are that they already trust and build those adults into your network. And all of those would be legitimate ways to build community guardianship. So what does working in this way mean? How we think about children and young people's voices? Well, there's 3 things I wanted to share with you. Okay, sorry, I'm keeping from behind me. Okay, so the first is that we need to think collaboratively and collectively about how we understand safety, and we have to go directly to young people to think about those collective ways to understand safety. Now, safety mapping is a principal method that we see being used across professions to do this, working with young people to map their local area or their school or their journey to and from college, or their journey to and from the intervention that they're being required to attend, to identify where are their red zones, where they feel unsafe, where are their green zones, where they feel safe, and where are their amber zones, which might be, oh, it's unsafe at 7, but it's all right at 10, for example. And then if they've identified a red zone, thinking about, are we asking them to travel through a red zone to get to where we need them to get to? Do they have to go through a red zone? In which case, do we need to identify green people for them in their red zone? Can we walk the route with them? So safety mapping is a really important way of identifying where young people feel safe, because often the places young people feel safe are not the places that we think. And the places we think they're unsafe, often they feel quite safe in. So it's a really important way of thinking about and understanding safety. And then when practitioners do this, we see this then embedded into social work and youth work assessments. So we see that in this excerpt here, where a social worker was talking about work they have done with a young person to understand safety. And this is a young person who witnessed their friend being stabbed the year before. And the social worker is saying, we have ongoing concerns for your safety, and everyone is finding it really difficult to keep you safe. You were really open with me about how this is impacting your mental health and how you're struggling not to retaliate. Now that type of relationship meant that the social worker could prioritise that young person's mental health in the plan, because that was what was integral to their safety at the time, and the young person was able to collaborate on that safety planning, rather than putting them onto interventions and into support services that weren't addressing the priority issue for that young person at the time, which was a fear around retaliation and their mental health. And in this excerpt, we also see a social worker writing to another young person who they're trying to get back into education. This young person was out of education. And the social worker says, there's been some progress made towards getting you back into mainstream school, and your mum and social worker are working hard to achieve this and ensure any school that is offered is in an area that you do not feel unsafe going. However, we have not achieved this yet, and this would be a tangible outcome towards you feeling more confident about your safety. So really clearly contextually informed planning here by the social worker. The goal is not to get the young person back in school. The goal is for the young person to feel safe in school every day, and to find a place in school where she feels safe going to. So safety mapping and safety work planning with the young person really shaping and informing what the social workers are doing, and the responsibility then sitting on them to resolve that, not sitting on the young person to resolve that. Okay, the second way in which we see youth voice really coming through in contextual safeguarding is trying to move people away from mapping young people's friendships. Now, I apologise if there are people in the room that like doing this. We see this happening a lot in organisations. We're concerned about young people's safety in their friendship groups. We're going to map their friendship groups. I have contributed to that narrative, absolutely. I produced maps of friendship groups when I was first trying to understand what young people were telling me. Unfortunately, that was often interpreted into we're going to go away and map young people's friendship groups without their knowledge or consent, and just use the information that we have to do that and not involve them in that process at all, which wasn't what I was doing when I was mapping friendship groups. Now, when we see peer group mapping as central to safeguarding, what we tend to find are assessments that read something like this, very dehumanised assessments, and dehumanisation has already been talked about this morning. So assessments that very much focused on who's connected to who's committing what offences, who knows who. That is not a welfare-based assessment. There's nothing about that relates to safeguarding. But this was a social work assessment, this language. It doesn't read like a social work assessment at all. When we're thinking about peer relationships, what we need to be doing is collaborating with young people to assess the nature of their peer relationships, understand them, and wrap support around them. And so we utilise assessment frameworks to do that. Mapping people is not the same as assessing them. When you assess a friendship group, you're not talking about who knows who. You're talking about what does the group need, what do they provide to each other, what is their access to guardianship, who are their protective adults, and what are the environmental and family factors that influence their safety. And while it might feel difficult to have those conversations with young people sometimes, we need to ask ourselves why we find it difficult to talk with them about their friends. They should feel confident and able to talk to us about their friends and the friendships that they have. But also, if we only ever talk about young people's friends when we think they're a risk, of course there's going to be an issue. We have to recognise that friendship is really integral to adolescent development, and any time you're supporting a young person, talking with them about their friends is going to be important. But also what we find is when we focus on mapping rather than assessing young people's friendships, people spend a lot of time producing these maps and then they don't know what to do with them because the young people have no idea that that's happened, and then they've got to broach some kind of conversation with the young people about interventions they're about to put in place. So at some point you are going to have to talk to young people about their friendships if you do this work for the purposes of safeguarding them. If you do it just to collect information about them, then no, you won't need to do that. But again, that also wouldn't be contextual safeguarding. So when you see assessments of young people's friendships, what we start to see is language like this. They are all talented with many core values and a capacity for kindness, and to use one of their favourite words, love. It is my opinion that they all have the potential for successful life outcomes if they can receive and make use of the best possible support. Now, both excerpts describe groups of young people who were being criminally exploited. Both excerpts describe groups of young people who had convictions for weapon possession and drugs-related offences, but they don't look like they're describing the same groups of young people, because one is a welfare-orientated assessment of a friendship group, and one is a map of people's connections. So definitely, if we're thinking about the voice of the child, we have to get to a place where we're comfortable about young people's voices shaping how we understand their friendships and how we respond to them. And then finally, we need to be able to think about community guardianship from the perspective of young people. Often when we hear about community guardianship, i.e. getting businesses and other people on board to help us with safeguarding them when they're outside the home, we hear phrases like, there are eyes and ears. These types of organisations should not be anyone's eyes and ears. They are relationships. They form the basis of relationships for young people through which they will access protection and support, not via lots of different mechanisms of surveillance. So we've just got more and more and more people watching young people, but nobody actually talking to them, working with them, supporting them, which is what community guardianship requires. So if we're going to look for adults in extra-familial contexts, we need to go directly to young people and their families to collaborate with them on who are the adults that provide safety for them, do they exist, and if they don't, what would they be looking for in an adult if they wanted to access safety when they were outside of their family home. We have to have community guardianship that's rooted in care and concern and love for young people, rather than disdain or a fixation on risk, which doesn't help us provide collaborative guardianship. When we are looking to involve statutory organisations in guardianship work, we have to think about their peer support networks, as I've already mentioned, and the extent to which their friendships already provide them with a sense of safety. And we've seen really progressive work done in that regard in respect, in Tanzania actually, for street-connected children, where peer relationships are really invested in to provide safety for children and young people. And when we're thinking about statutory providers, we need to come from a place of restoration, not assuming that we're always wanted in public spaces. We saw some really effective work in one of our test sites during COVID, where there was very low levels of guardianship because businesses were closed, around a group of young people who were being sexually exploited, and the only people that were available were the police, because everybody else was meant to be indoors. The young people did not want to talk to the police. They had no interest in talking to the police. They had a very poor relationship with them, and they didn't trust them. They didn't want them as community guardians. But that was what was available. And what we saw was some really brilliant work by the police in that locality, who offered their horses, because they had a mounted police service, they offered their horses as a source of equine therapy for that group of young people by way of an apology for previous poor interactions. And that offer of those horses was the foundation upon which trust could gradually be built to get to a point where those young people were willing to use a code word with the police when they wanted to be removed from that situation that they were in. If they were in public space and they felt unsafe. So the response could not have been, we're just going to deploy police into that area. That was not what was needed, but because that was the only resource, there had to be restorative work done to enable that to be the approach, and it worked really well for that police force and for the young people. So what does working like this, thinking about youth voice in this way, require of our systems? This is what I want to conclude with. Well, it requires us to move from a place where we're watching young people and towards a place where we're working with them, away from surveillance and towards relationship. Okay, and that is, again, very counterculture. We often train people, as I said, to be our eyes and ears, to watch people, to monitor them, to call in, to report, but not to talk to young people. Young people will go into shops where they trust the workers and say, can you call the police, can you help me? They will seek out youth workers and bus drivers and residents who are trustworthy and who have demonstrated that they care about them. And that's the type of relational guardianship that we need to be working towards. But it also requires quite a heap of humility in services and partnerships that often struggle with humility and struggle with power sharing. If we're going to really be able to humble ourselves to listen to young people's voices, we need to think about our responsibility. Not just young people's responsibility or their parents and carers' responsibility, but our collective responsibility to create safety around children and young people. So holding ourselves to account when we fall short, not just them. We need to recognise the ask of us is going to be different. We're not just going to be asked to provide information about individual children or deliver a service to an individual child. We're going to be asked to reflect on our contribution to making a context safe, or our contribution to creating a lack of safety in public spaces. We're going to have to power shift and increase the weight that we give to young people and families' voices within systems that are often dominated by system intelligence rather than relational forms of information. And we have to look at how we position ourselves. We often position ourselves as safe, and then we're protecting children from all this harm out there. When in reality, a lot of what we do is also unsafe for children and young people, and we have to recognise we have the capacity to be unsafe and safe, as well as other things. And when we can do that, it boosts our ability to be safe. And this quote, I think, is so good from a practitioner and manager in a site we were working with, when she was talking about some of the pilot work they've been doing with us to redesign their services. And she said, you don't deviate from the plan that you've already had normally, because it protects the children we think. It protects you as a worker. And she was being really honest. We're doing things that we know are not making children unsafe, but it protects us, it protects our organisation. We can demonstrate that we're doing things that we need to do. And so she said, doing this has taken us out of our comfort zone, and we've had to think a little bit differently, and it's left us feeling quite vulnerable at times. And I often think if you're working in statutory services and you're not very vulnerable, then you're probably not leaning in enough to the humility that's required to really transform how we protect children and young people. So I ask you whether you're willing to have your perspectives challenged, to recognise that you don't always know the whole picture, and young people will tell us that. We need to be working with them, with relationships of trust rather than surveillance, with parents, partners in our safeguarding endeavours rather than the target of them. We need to look inward at our own services to try to reform them, and we have to reimagine the role of potentially non-traditional partners. So I want to finish with this slide from young people, which we do this activity in schools, and this we ask young people to rate how often things happen basically in their school environment. And this group of young people, on one side was this never happens, and on the other side it was this happens all the time. So these young people said that abuse in relationships and the rating of students was happening, but not that frequently within their school. Receiving unwanted sexual images, pressure to share sexual images, unwanted touching, sexual images being shared without consent, and pressure to perform sexual acts happening all the time. Now, interestingly, this was in a school where 90% of the parents we surveyed said they would know if sexual harm was happening to their child, and it wasn't. It was also in a school that adopted a zero-tolerance approach to sexual harassment and abuse, and they noted that once they adopted that approach, they saw a massive reduction in complaints, and they thought that was a reduction in harm. What young people were telling us, it wasn't a reduction in harm, it was a reduction in them telling anyone about the harm, because they didn't want their friends to be excluded from school, they just wanted the behaviour to stop. And the adoption of blanket punitive policies meant that they knew if they sought help, what they were also doing was signing the exclusion papers for that child, and that was something they didn't want to do, so they just stopped talking about it. So that school needed to understand that by listening to young people, what young people wanted and what they were experiencing rather than what they thought was in their best interest, was really going to be the only mechanism to providing safety. And that means they needed to humble themselves to understand that actually some of their well-intended interventions were causing more harm than good, and be willing to reimagine what safety looked like from young people's perspectives. So I hope that's been a helpful whistle-stop tour on how you develop safeguarding systems that are built on care rather than built on justice and punishment, and I'm happy to be contacted if you have any other questions.